All right, ready? So, welcome Matthew and Jules video session number 2 with Fannys Bay. I'm Holly here, and today we're going to be discussing grains, milling, mashing, and water. Those are a lot of very important ingredients and pieces of the puzzle for making whiskey. So, we don't have too long, but I want to start with grains. I know that what we brought over and what I've had while at the distillery is single malt. So that would be 100% malted barley.
Yes.
So I'd love to hear about where you get your barley. And I know you've had some experimental runs as well with some different grains.
Yes, that's right. We use, in some cases, the Tasmanian barley. And we also use, if we're doing a peated barley, we'll bring in the grain from Scotland and the South Island of New Zealand. And that's quite interesting because the percentage of smoking to each is the same, so many parts per million. But when you think about what grows in New Zealand and ends up as peat and what grows in Scotland and ends up as peat, very vastly different. So the flavors are very different. So that's very interesting. We also bring in non-peated barley from New Zealand and also New South Wales and Victoria, the states of Australia, different varieties of barley. I like to change different varieties because they do give us different flavors.
Okay. Can you name some of those varieties, or I guess your favorite varieties?
Well, at the moment, my favourite is a company, Gladsfield, in the South Island of New Zealand. One of the reasons why they're my favourite is that they go to the farmer and say, would you like to grow barley? Yes, please. Yes, I'll do that. They come and sow it. I, the farmer, look after while it grows. They then harvest it. And then the farmer gets paid for the tonnage that they make from it. And then they leave it with the farmer in the silos there and pay them rental. And when I ring up and order barley, I want X, Y, Z, that's what I get. I don't get part of that and part of that and part of that. So if I want Westminster, for instance, that's what I get.
Okay. Yes, I know.
Yeah.
I was going to ask what varietal of the grain, but I know Westminster is one that you work with quite a bit, right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
What's
yes,
a secondary that you like?
Oh, gee, I'd have to go
Peated
and look at the
Westminster.
sheet. Yes, that's about it. Although Julie doesn't like me working with that, but yeah, it brings out some very lovely flavors. Yes.
No, the New Zealand peat is really a cool topic that I'm excited to share with people. Maybe we'll be able to experience that down the road and in the future. But we don't, as whiskey drinkers, get to experience a lot of different styles of peat. We're usually within the confines of, is it Highland or coastal or island peat from Scotland? I know in the United States with Westland, they're trying to and have gained access to some US based, the Pacific Northwest, some of their peat bogs. But it was a tricky road. You know, these are a lot of times public, private lands and hard to gain access to. So New Zealand peat, I mean, that just sounds wild. It just sounds very, very coastal.
Yes, it is. It's a very, very good grain. Yes, like working with that. Yes.
Oh, that's awesome. And I know that you have been pretty particular with your grist ratios, with your how much flour you want and when you're actually milling, and you mill on site, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, the actual breaking, I call it the breaking of the barley, is very important. The lesser amount of flour base that we have, that's the very fines, the better our flavors are. And you'll find that in brewing beer as well. You reduce the amount of very fines that you have. That's very important, yes. And with that, and the choice of the temperatures that you strike at, which will give you flavors and also sugars, some fermentable, some non-fermentable, which are based in they call it the brewer's window. So you can establish how much of the non-fermentable sugars you want and how much of the fermentable sugars. Being small that we are, it's not about putting out huge amounts, so we can experiment with those non-fermentable sugars, which make a difference. Yes.
Right. And with the mashing, can you describe your mash tun? I know now we'll have to start talking about, just your temperature and climate up where you are. We know it's coastal, but I know that will start to play a factor, and as we move through fermentation and distillation. But can you talk a little bit about mashing?
Yes, we use, it's not a huge mash tun. I do it in batches of 600 litres, as we have two 600 litre fermenters, so they're not huge. And we take our time. We don't hurry any of it up. That's rule number one. Do not be in a hurry. So we bring the water in at the given temperature that we want, and then mash and grind the grain directly into the mash tun. And then it sits in that for an hour, and every quarter of an hour it gets stirred. And in that time, it basically changes the amount of grain, which is 150 kilo, to somewhere around about the 94 kilo of sugars in the water, which is quite high. Yes. So most of our when we finish fermenting, we're up in the 7s and 8%.
Okay. And if you mentioned it, I just missed it, but what temperature, what were the two exact temperatures? Do you have them, or do they vary from the water?
No, they vary from what I want to do, which will also, what adds to that is what barrels I'm going to be putting it into.
Okay.
So by changing the actual strike temperature will change the amount of fermentable sugar in comparison to the non-fermentable sugar. Right. Yeah, so I change that quite frequently.
And I know this is where your water comes into play too, and what water you're using. And I know water is always with an asterisk of, but you're distilling it. So, isn't it just the importance of water is when you're proofing something down, but I think it's still obviously an important factor, even if it's just whether you get good or bad yields, right? If you mess up the grain or don't mess up the grain or fermentation. But can you talk about the water that you're using throughout the process? Yes,
the magical thing about our water is it starts with where we live, and we live on a point. And when the frontal weather comes through, all the big waves are breaking on the point. So the air is full of salts and everything that's in the sea, so much so that the building we're in, there's cladding on it that may need replacing shortly, as that's how rusty it goes. There's a lot of salts. And we use captured water from that building. So it has what's in the sea is in our water. And that is exactly what the yeast cell likes to work with.
Would you say it's a hard or soft water?
Hard water, yes. Yes, nice hard water. And that also has an influence on the mashing as well. Right. A big influence, yes.
Yeah, being coastal, it's always, you think Bowmore and you think some of these Scottish coastal distilleries, and you start to question, how much of an influence is it? Now, I know they have some warehouses that are actually getting coastal influence during maturation, but a lot of their warehouses are on the mainland. So how much are you actually getting? But with a distillery like Fannys Bay, you can rest assured that you're not trucking casks up to mainland Australia for, for maturation. It's all happening with your sea salt air. So
yes, and what it does also for us is that being next to the sea, the temperature within the bond room where its maceration's happening is more constant. We don't get a big high then a big low in temperatures. It's quite constant.
Even.
Yes, quite even temperature. Yes.
No, that's great.